Fear. It's the greatest obstacle on the path to success, but once you conquer it, nothing is impossible. The most successful people, the billionaires of the world, aren't fearless. What sets them apart is their courage to face fear and triumph over it. Here I bring you chilling horror stories designed to challenge your mind. Each tale is an opportunity to build your courage, overcome invisible fears, and grow stronger in life. If this is your first time visiting the channel, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Get ready. Our journey into the world of horror begins now. Jake and Emily had been friends since college, and their road trip from Colorado to California was all about attending a mutual friend's wedding. After driving nonstop for an entire day, the endless stretches of golden highways and barren fields seemed to go on forever. By nightfall, they decided to find a place to stop and grab something to eat. "Look over there, a diner." Emily pointed toward a flickering neon sign not too far ahead. The sign blinked, "Open 24 hours." Given that it was the only place they'd seen for miles, it felt like a godsend. They pulled into the empty parking lot. The diner was small and weathered, but a warm yellow glow spilled from its windows, promising something familiar. Jake pushed the door open with Emily close behind. Inside, the place was simple: a row of wooden tables, chairs neatly tucked in, and soft bulbs hanging overhead, casting dim, hazy light. At a far table sat a couple who barely spoke, heads down over their meals. The room was unnervingly quiet, and it didn't help that the only server in the place was already watching them as they walked in. "Welcome, folks. What can I get for you tonight?" the server asked. His voice broke the silence like a creaking door, and Emily couldn't help but shiver slightly. Jake smiled, trying to shake off the odd vibe. "Hey there, we're starving and beat. Got anything simple and good?" The man nodded slowly and handed over a laminated menu that looked as though it had seen better days. Emily glanced down at the handwritten items, things like rice bread, grilled meat with bean sauce, and other basic dishes. Nothing unusual. "I'll just have a salad," Emily said, handing the menu back. "Burger and fries for me," Jake added, stretching his arms tiredly. As the server disappeared into the kitchen, Emily looked around the room again. Her eyes landed on a wall filled with black and white photos. They were mostly candid shots of small-town life: farmers, old couples, kids playing in fields. But there was something strange about the faces in the photos. Most of them stared directly at the camera, their expressions eerily blank. Emily shifted in her seat and leaned toward Jake. "This place feels weird." Jake chuckled, dismissing her. "It's just a hole-in-the-wall diner. Relax. Food's food, right?" Still, as Emily sat back, her eyes drifted back to the photographs. For a moment, she could have sworn one of the faces, a man near the corner of the wall, looked familiar. While waiting for their food, Emily noticed the walls of the diner were covered with photographs. Each picture captured scenes of rural life, most of them featuring the faces of customers who appeared to have been photographed right there in the diner. Some people were smiling brightly, while others looked slightly awkward in front of the camera. However, what unsettled Emily was that a few of the photos seemed strange. Some of the people in the pictures looked like they were staring directly at her, their eyes unnervingly intense. "Jake, look at this. Do you see anything weird?" Emily pointed toward the wall. Jake glanced up, shrugged, and said, "They're just old photos. I guess the owners like to capture memories." Emily didn't argue, but the uneasy feeling lingered. She turned back to face the table, though her eyes kept darting to the photos. It felt as though someone, or something, was watching her. The waiter returned with their food. Emily's salad was placed in front of her, and Jake got his burger and fries. But the moment the plates hit the table, Emily felt her stomach tighten. Her salad looked perfectly fine, but there was something off about the smell coming from Jake's burger. "Jake, do you smell that? It's weird." Jake just laughed and took a bite of the burger. "It's not bad. Kinda odd, maybe, but they probably use some special seasoning or something." Emily nodded, trying to convince herself that she was overthinking it, but as Jake kept eating, she couldn't shake the feeling that the waiter's eyes were still on them, particularly on Jake. The man stood a short distance away, watching with that same strange smile plastered on his face. "Let's just eat quick and get out of here," Emily muttered under her breath. Jake raised an eyebrow. "What's with you? You're acting tense. It's just a small-town diner." Emily didn't respond. She pushed her salad around with her fork, the uneasy feeling gnawing at her more with every passing second. Something about this place, this food, and that waiter didn't sit right. deep down she knew they shouldn't stick around any longer. While Jake was in the bathroom, Emily took the opportunity to take a closer look at the photos on the wall. One picture in the top corner caught her attention. It showed a couple sitting at a table in the diner, eerily similar to where Jake and she were sitting now. Their clothes, their posture, it all looked almost identical to them. But what sent a chill down Emily's spine was the small handwritten caption beneath the photo. "The last trip, 1998. Emily staggered back, bumping into the table behind her. The noise made the waiter turn around, his gaze now sharp and probing. "Is everything all right, miss?" he asked, his voice lower and heavier than before. "No, it's nothing," Emily stammered, trying to steady her breathing and keep her composure. Her heart pounded violently in her chest. Jake returned, looking completely at ease. "Ready to go? I'm good to hit the road." Emily shot up from her seat, grabbing her purse. "Let's go." They paid quickly and walked out. From the window, the waiter watched them leave, that strange smile still plastered across his face. As they got into the car and pulled away, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were still on them, following them into the dark night, no matter how far they drove. On the road, Jake casually remarked, "That burger wasn't bad at all. How about your salad?" Emily didn't answer. Her mind was still racing with thoughts about the photo and the writing underneath it. She decided she needed to tell Jake what she'd seen, but just as she turned to speak, she noticed Jake had gone pale. Slowly, he brought a hand to his stomach. "Jake, what's wrong?" Emily asked, her voice laced with worry. I don't know. I just suddenly feel really sick," Jake said, his voice weak and shaky. Emily quickly pulled the car over to the side of the road. Jake threw open the door, doubling over as he vomited onto the pavement. Emily watched helplessly, her fear growing. It felt like things were spinning out of control. She grabbed her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. "Hold on, I'll drive us to the nearest town," she said, trying to sound calm. But as she looked up, her hands tightened on the steering wheel and her stomach dropped. Up ahead, the neon lights of the diner glowed again, exactly as they had before. It was as if they'd never left. No, this can't be. We drove away. I know we drove away," Emily muttered to herself, her voice trembling. Jake didn't respond. He slumped in his seat, his breathing heavy and labored. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as panic set in. She glanced into the rear-view mirror and froze. In the distance, standing just off the road, was a figure. The person seemed to be waving, but in the dim light, she couldn't make out their face. "Jake, wake up. Please, we have to get out of here," Emily screamed, shaking his shoulder. But Jake remained slumped, unresponsive, as the figure in the distance began to step closer. No, this can't be. We drove away. I know we drove away," Emily muttered to herself, her voice trembling. Jake didn't respond. He slumped in his seat, his breathing heavy and labored. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as panic set in. She glanced into the rear-view mirror and froze. In the distance, standing just off the road, was a figure. The person seemed to be waving, but in the dim light, she couldn't make out their face. "Jake, wake up. Please, we have to get out of here," Emily screamed, shaking his shoulder. But Jake remained slumped, unresponsive, as the figure in the distance began to step closer. She turned the car around, ignoring everything else, and sped off in the opposite direction. But no matter how far she drove, the neon lights of the diner kept appearing ahead of her, as if they were trapped in an endless loop with no way out. The only question left in Emily's mind was, how do we escape this place? This story begins in a small town where Ethan, a high school senior, found himself caught in a chain of events he would never forget. That evening, like most others, Ethan stayed late in the school library to work on a programming assignment. His old laptop at home wasn't powerful enough, so he relied on the worn-down computers in the library. Sitting next to Ethan that day was Samuel, a strange classmate. Samuel was an enigma, tall, pale, and withdrawn. He kept his face hidden behind long black hair and rarely spoke to anyone. His presence was always accompanied by an unsettling coldness that made people uneasy. When Ethan sat down, Samuel lifted his head and looked at him. His gaze was empty, yet somehow menacing, sending a shiver down Ethan's spine. Uncomfortable, Ethan avoided eye contact and began typing on his keyboard. Suddenly, Samuel spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "Do you believe in curses?" Ethan froze, caught off guard. "What?" he asked, turning toward Samuel. Samuel didn't respond. Instead, he smirked faintly and muttered, "There are some things you're better off not knowing." Ethan decided not to engage further. He turned back to his screen and pretended to be engrossed in his work. Moments later, Samuel stood up and left without another word, leaving behind a small black USB drive on the table. Ethan noticed it and decided he'd return it the next day, but that was the last time Ethan saw Samuel. Samuel never came back to school. He was known for his long absences, so no one thought much of it at first. Weeks turned into months, and Samuel's absence became permanent. Eventually, everyone forgot about him, everyone except Ethan. One day, while cleaning out his desk, Ethan stumbled upon the USB drive. Intrigued by the mystery surrounding Samuel's disappearance, he decided to plug it into his computer. The drive contained 3 folders, each named after a story: The Curse of the Wanderer, The Darkness Below, and The Soulless Puppet. Curiosity got the better of him, and Ethan opened the first story, The Curse of the Wanderer. It told of a man who found a ring lying on the side of the road. After putting it on, he began to experience strange nightmares. In these dreams, he stood on a desolate road, surrounded by countless invisible eyes watching him. Each day, the fear grew more intense until he could bear it no longer. One night, he ran into the road and disappeared, never to be seen again. The story ended abruptly, leaving Ethan unsettled. Still, he felt compelled to open the second folder, The Darkness Below. This story was about a young woman living in an old house. Every night she heard knocking sounds coming from the basement. At first, she dismissed it as rats or the wind, but the knocking grew louder and more deliberate, always at the same time each night. One evening, she ventured into the basement to investigate and found a blood-stained note warning her to leave the house before sunrise. If she didn't, she would never see daylight again. The story ended with the woman trapped forever in the basement's darkness. Ethan's chest tightened as he finished reading. His room felt colder, and the silence around him was suffocating. Yet he couldn't stop himself from opening the third and final story, The Soulless Puppet. This story was the strangest of the 3. It told of a boy who received a puppet as a birthday gift. At first, he loved the toy, but over time, he noticed it seemed to move on its own when he wasn't looking. One day, he discovered an inscription carved inside the puppet. Its master will be the last to see it smile. On the boy's next birthday, he disappeared without a trace. The puppet was later found on his desk, its face frozen in a sinister grin. As Ethan finished reading the last story, his computer screen suddenly went black. He jumped, his heart racing. The room felt unnervingly still, as though something was watching him, and then he heard it, a faint knock, distant yet deliberate. Ethan's breath hitched. The sound seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He glanced around his room, trying to convince himself it was his imagination. But deep down, Ethan knew this was only the beginning. That night, Ethan barely slept. The stories from the USB stuck in his mind, replaying over and over in vivid detail. The final story, The Soulless Puppet, haunted him the most, sending shivers down his spine each time he thought about it. He tried convincing himself it was all just a coincidence, but a nagging voice in his head screamed otherwise. Something terrible was happening. The next morning, Ethan received a call from a former classmate. The voice on the other end was panicked, trembling. "Hey, have you heard?" The police found Samuel. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He gripped his phone tightly, struggling to stay calm. "Found him? What do you mean? What happened to Samuel?" "Samuel's dead, Ethan. They found him in his house. But the thing is, he's been dead since the last day we saw him at school." Ethan felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. He stammered, "Dead? But how?" The classmate's voice dropped to a near whisper. "The police said they found him lying on the floor in his bedroom. The strange part, he was holding a wooden puppet in his hands. And on that puppet there were carvings, weird symbols. They're saying it matches some of the stuff Samuel used to doodle in his notebooks during class." Ethan's blood ran cold. Symbols? A puppet? The details sounded eerily similar to the story The Soulless Puppet from the USB. He rushed to his desk, powered on his computer, and reopened the last story. This time he paid closer attention to the cryptic symbols at the bottom of the page, symbols he had dismissed as random decorations earlier. Ethan couldn't understand their meaning, but as he compared them to the strange sketches Samuel used to make, the resemblance was undeniable. His breath quickened as a horrifying realization began to form. Samuel was dead, and what happened to him seemed to mirror the story on the USB, a story Samuel had left behind, almost like a warning or a curse. The next day, Ethan couldn't keep this to himself any longer. He decided to visit the local police station to learn more about Samuel's death. After much pleading and explaining, Ethan was allowed to speak with the officer handling the case. The officer, a middle-aged man with dark circles under his eyes, eyed Ethan skeptically. So why are you so interested in this case? Were you close to Samuel? Ethan nodded, trying to sound composed. We were in the same class. I need to know if there was anything unusual about how he died. The officer sighed, leaning back in his chair. Unusual? Yeah, you could say that. When we found him, Samuel was lying on the floor in his bedroom. He'd been dead for days, but there were no signs of a struggle or foul play. He was just there, holding this creepy wooden puppet. And his eyes, they were wide open like he'd seen something that scared him to death. We can't explain it. The medical examiner says it looks like he had a massive heart attack, but that doesn't add up for someone his age. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat, but the officer wasn't finished. And the puppet? It had some kind of symbols carved into it. We've sent it to specialists, but no one's been able to figure out what they mean. What did the symbols look like? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer pulled out a file and placed a photograph on the desk. It showed the puppet with strange carvings etched into its chest. Ethan's hands trembled as he stared at the image. The symbols were identical to the ones he had seen at the end of the soulless puppet. Ethan mumbled an excuse and bolted from the station. His mind raced as he ran home. There was no doubt now. The USB carried a curse, and Samuel had been its first victim. That night, Ethan couldn't stop staring at the USB on his desk. He wanted to destroy it, throw it away, or do anything to rid himself of it. But deep down, he feared that doing so might only make things worse. The image of Samuel holding that puppet haunted him, and a terrifying thought began to creep into his mind. Was he the next victim, or would the curse choose someone else? Ethan's thoughts turned to his family, his parents and younger sister. What if the curse didn't stop at him? What if it spread to them? The house felt eerily quiet that night, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Faint, almost imperceptible sounds echoed through the darkness. Soft footsteps, distant whispers, and, worst of all, a quiet, unsettling giggle from the hallway. Ethan sat frozen in his chair, heart pounding. Was it real, or was his mind playing tricks on him? He didn't know, and maybe that was the most terrifying part of all. The story ends here, but what do you think? Is the curse real, or is it just Ethan's mind unraveling under the weight of fear? The answer perhaps lies within the USB itself. Want to hear more? Let me know your thoughts. In a bustling neighborhood in the heart of the city, Ethan lived with his two close friends, Lucas and Ryan, in a small apartment. Their place sat on the top floor of an old rundown building where everything seemed a little temporary and far from perfect. Ethan's room was divided in half by a curtain, separating his bed from the storage area. In the far corner of the room stood a heavy old wardrobe, its weathered doors a testament to years of neglect. Ethan had never paid much attention to the wardrobe until one strange night. That evening, Lucas and Ryan were out, leaving Ethan alone in the apartment. The wind howled through the cracks in the old windows, creating eerie, unsettling noises. Ethan sat on his bed, engrossed in a movie on his laptop, doing his best to ignore the chilling atmosphere that seemed to envelop the room. Around midnight, a faint rattling sound caught his attention. He paused the movie and strained to listen. The noise seemed to be coming from the wardrobe in the corner. At first, Ethan brushed it off, thinking the wind might have caused the wardrobe's doors to shift. But then the sound came again. This time, it was different. It wasn't just a rattle. It sounded like something, or someone, scraping against the wood. A sense of unease crept over him, making the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Ethan hesitated, but eventually got up, turned on the light, and cautiously approached the wardrobe. He opened its doors, his breath catching in his throat. Inside, there were only a few old jackets and a cardboard box filled with random junk. Ethan let out a nervous laugh, shaking his head. "I'm losing it," he muttered to himself. Closing the wardrobe doors, he returned to his bed. But no sooner had he settled back under the covers than the noise returned. Louder this time, unmistakably deliberate. It was no longer just a rattle or a scrape. Now, it sounded like faint breathing. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. His palms were slick with sweat as he slowly sat up. Gathering every ounce of courage, he walked back to the wardrobe. Instead of opening it right away, he pressed his ear against the door. For a moment, there was silence, but then, clear as day, he heard it. A low, raspy breath, barely audible but undeniably there. He stumbled backward, his eyes locked on the wardrobe. "Who's there?" Ethan's voice cracked as he spoke, his words trembling with fear. The room was deathly quiet. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan forced himself to open the wardrobe again. This time, he pulled everything out. The jackets, the box, all of it, leaving the inside completely empty. The wardrobe stood bare, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His eyes scanned every corner, every surface. That's when he noticed the bottom panel of the wardrobe. One of the wooden planks looked loose, slightly misaligned with the rest. He crouched down, carefully pried it up, and revealed a small hidden compartment beneath. Inside the compartment was a dusty, battered leather journal. Ethan's hand shook as he picked it up and flipped it open. The pages were filled with messy, uneven handwriting, the ink smudged and faded with age. But what made his blood run cold were the repeated words scrawled across page after page. "I'm trapped. Help me." Ethan slammed the journal shut and threw it onto the floor as though it had burned him. He collapsed onto the bed, his breathing ragged and uneven. The room felt colder, darker, as if the air itself had thickened with dread. Just then, the front door swung open. Lucas and Ryan walked in, their voices loud and cheerful, until they saw Ethan sitting on the bed, pale and shaking. "What happened?" Lucas asked, rushing over. Ethan tried to explain, stumbling over his words as he recounted the strange noises, the hidden compartment, and the journal. His friends exchanged skeptical glances but decided to check the wardrobe for themselves. When Lucas pulled up the loose plank, the compartment was empty. The journal was gone. "What the hell?" Ryan muttered, staring at the empty space. "Are you sure you didn't just imagine it?" "I'm telling you it was right there," Ethan insisted, his voice rising. "I saw it. I read it." Lucas and Ryan searched the room thoroughly, but there was no sign of the journal or anything unusual. That night, none of them slept. Ethan sat awake in his bed, staring at the wardrobe, half expecting it to creak open on its own. Lucas and Ryan stayed in the living room, their uneasy silence betraying the disbelief they tried to maintain. The next morning, Ethan stood in front of the wardrobe one last time. The loose plank was still there, but the hidden compartment was now just an empty void. He closed the wardrobe doors tightly and whispered to himself, "I need to get out of this place." For the first time in years, Ethan felt like his home wasn't his anymore. Someone had left its mark, and it wasn't going to let him forget. Everything had been normal until one night. The three friends came home late, exhausted from studying for their upcoming exams. As soon as they entered the apartment, they went straight to bed, too drained to even speak. The room gradually sank into silence, broken only by the faint whistling of the wind through the old window frames and the steady breathing of Lucas and Ryan. But Ethan couldn't sleep as deeply as his two friends. That night, somewhere in the middle of the night, Ethan woke up with a start. A sense of unease gripped his chest, though he couldn't quite figure out why he was awake. The room was eerily quiet, but then he heard it, a faint sound from the far corner of the room. Poop. Poop. It was soft, like someone trying to stifle their breathing. Ethan's heart began to pound. He froze in place, straining to listen, holding his breath as if that would help him hear better. The sound was still there, quiet but unmistakable. He glanced over at Lucas and Ryan. Both were still fast asleep, oblivious to the strange noise. Ethan thought about waking them but hesitated. "It's probably just the wind. Or maybe I'm imagining it," he told himself, trying to calm his nerves. But the sound persisted, and this time it changed. It was no longer just breathing. It now resembled the faint scratching of something against wood. The sound was coming from the wardrobe at the far end of the room. Swallowing hard, Ethan sat up. He moved cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the air in the room had thickened. He approached the wardrobe, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. Click. The door swung open, revealing the same neatly hung coats and jackets Ethan had seen a dozen times before. Nothing appeared out of place, but the unease didn't fade. Something was still wrong. He pushed the coats aside, his hand brushing against the back panel of the wardrobe. And that's when he saw it. A pair of glowing eyes. They stared at him from the shadows of the wardrobe, cold, empty, and unblinking. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Ethan felt every muscle in his body freeze as a chilling wave of terror crashed over him. He stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of his bed, and let out a blood-curdling scream. At that exact moment, a figure shot out from the wardrobe with inhuman speed, a blur of movement that darted past him before he could even react. Ethan scrambled to the light switch and flicked it on, flooding the room with harsh light. The figure was gone. All that remained was the wardrobe door, now swinging slightly on its hinges, and the front door of the apartment, which creaked as it came to a slow stop, left ajar. Lucas and Ryan jolted awake, their eyes wide with panic. "What's going on?" Lucas shouted, looking around in confusion. There was someone here, Ethan yelled, pointing toward the front door. He was hiding in the wardrobe. I saw him. Without a second thought, Lucas and Ryan jumped out of bed and ran toward the door, hoping to catch whoever had been there. They bolted down the stairwell, their footsteps echoing through the building. But when they reached the street, there was no one. Whoever it was had vanished into the night. When they returned to the apartment, they found Ethan sitting on the floor, trembling, his face pale. His wide, unfocused eyes stared into the distance as if still processing what had just happened. Lucas knelt beside him, gripping his shoulders. It's okay, we're here now. We'll figure this out. You're safe. Ryan grabbed his phone and called the police. 15 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of their small apartment. 2 officers arrived and began questioning the friends while inspecting the scene. After a thorough search, one of the officers returned with a grim expression. We found some evidence behind the wardrobe, he said. It looks like someone had been hiding there for a while. It's possible they entered through a window or an air vent. You should all be more cautious. Lock your windows and doors before going to sleep. Ethan felt his stomach drop. The officer's words echoed in his mind. Someone had been hiding there for a while. The officer continued. This isn't the first time we've had reports like this in the area. Sometimes homeless individuals sneak into buildings looking for a place to stay. We'll keep investigating, but you all should stay alert. After the police left, the room fell silent again, but none of them felt any sense of relief. Ethan's eyes drifted back to the wardrobe, its door still hanging wide open. The light illuminated its empty interior, but it didn't feel empty. Something still felt wrong, very wrong. After that night, none of the 3 friends felt safe in the apartment anymore. Ethan began to suffer from insomnia. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those horrifying eyes staring back at him, felt the paralyzing dread of standing before the wardrobe. Lucas and Ryan weren't doing much better. They often jumped at the smallest sounds, whether it was the creak of a wooden door or the faint whistle of wind slipping through the window frames. The apartment was no longer a place of rest, but a weight on their minds. Even during the day, with sunlight streaming through the windows, the oppressive atmosphere lingered. Every time Lucas walked past the wardrobe, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be hiding inside, waiting for the light to fade before stepping out. A week after the incident, Ethan, Lucas, and Ryan sat down together in the living room. All 3 agreed they couldn't stay here any longer. It's time for us to leave, Ethan said, his voice low but firm. I can't spend another night here. Lucas nodded in agreement. It's not just about safety. Mentally, we're breaking down. This place, it's no longer right for us. Ryan stayed silent for a moment before speaking. You're right. This isn't something we can fix by locking the doors tighter or installing more cameras. What we need is a fresh start. 2 weeks later, the 3 friends stood in front of a new apartment in a bustling neighborhood, far from their old place. The building had modern security systems and the area felt much safer. We made the right choice, Ryan said, placing a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. This is a new chapter. No more sleepless nights or constant fear. Ethan looked at the new apartment and nodded slightly, but deep down he knew he wouldn't forget what had happened. The memories of those eyes, the figure that burst out of the wardrobe, and the sheer terror of facing the unknown were still etched into his mind. That first night in the new apartment, Ethan stepped out onto the balcony, breathing in the crisp night air. He tried convincing himself that it was over, that they were safe now. But as he turned to head back into his room, his gaze fell on the new wardrobe. The door was slightly ajar, and the darkness inside felt like a black hole, pulling his attention. Ethan froze for a moment. His heart pounded and his fist clenched unconsciously. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward the wardrobe and opened the door. Nothing. Just neatly hung clothes and empty space. Ethan exhaled in relief, but part of him remained on edge. Even though they'd left the old apartment, the fear and unease still clung to him. He closed the wardrobe door, switched off the light, and climbed into bed. In the next room, Lucas and Ryan were already fast asleep, but Ethan lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling. One question kept echoing in his mind. Who was that person? And why us? In the darkness, those unanswered questions gnawed at Ethan's thoughts. But at least now he knew one thing for certain. Leaving had been the right decision. Life would go on, but the haunting memories of the old apartment would remain with them forever. Thank you for watching our story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to hit like to show your support, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. We'd love to hear your feedback in the comments section to help us improve and bring you even more engaging stories. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in the next video.